Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. The War Bride's Oath. Synopsis. She was meant for love. He was meant for hate. Princess Cecilia hailed from the Dragon Empire, while Prince Ashen was from the Eastern Kingdom. With their countries divided by numerous wars and unending animosity for centuries, those two should have never crossed paths. Nevertheless, fate had different intentions for them, and rather than another conflict, a new era arrives, presenting unforeseen challenges and fresh threats. Armed only with her abilities and a legendary war dragon alongside her, Cecilia is dispatched as a potential bride to the merciless Ashen, the new monarch of the Eastern Kingdom, now referred to as the White King. What will take place now that she is trapped in his castle, at his mercy? This is the sequel of The Mercy of the God of War. Episode 1. A very old empire that had seen centuries pass by and never flinched. From the northern barbarians to the pirates of the White Sea, and then the vain attempt of the Eastern Republic, nothing had been able to scratch within an inch of their strong borders. The long line of its rulers, always covered in gold and imperial purple, only ever feared their own progeny, for it seemed each heir was stronger than their father. Their only notable conflicts were internal wars between the fierce brothers, all hoping to claim the Golden Throne as theirs. However, for over 2 decades now, no man had been seated on the large, golden throne of the Emperor. This vast empire was thriving, now more than ever, with an empress at its head. The man had tried to study as much as he could to prepare himself. It was no easy task. His country had been at odds with the Dragon Empire for centuries, and their cultures were too different. He had tried to collect scraps of information, here and there, to get ready for this very special day. A day that would be recorded in history, perhaps. He took a deep breath, his eyes on the imperial palace as he stood in the long line of people wishing to be granted entry. The imperial palace itself was as vast as a small city. For centuries, it had been the house of the emperor and his large family, his children, the empress when there was one, but most importantly, all of the concubines. The long line of the dragon emperors had mostly continued through the many children those emperors had fathered. Those large families needed to be housed in the imperial palace, thus, that place had only grown with time. As an emperor thrived, he had his concubines, and his children often had their own concubines and children. Of course, it was also practically cleared out with each new emperor taking over. No smart man kept his rivals close, hence, said siblings were usually all killed in a matter of days before the new emperor sat on the throne, had his own children and concubines take over, and that circle of life and death would start all over again. However, no concubines were currently residing in the imperial palace. The empress did have male concubines, but none of them were allowed to live there. Within her first year as the new ruler, she declared that she wouldn't have any children to succeed her, and instead, her nephew would be the new heir apparent. Strangely, he couldn't understand why this decision had been welcomed. That nephew was the son of the empress' brother, the rumored war god. Yet, why would she allow her brother's son to inherit her throne, instead of having her own children? There had been no proof of the empress being sterile, and according to the locals, she had actually taken medicine to prevent pregnancy for years before she even fought to rise to her position. Did she feel like she owed this to her brother, who had helped in her ascension? Then, why not let the war god himself become emperor? Surely, this would have been much simpler than establishing a woman on the golden throne. This was a mystery he hadn't solved yet. Next, yelled the Imperial Guard. He had to hand over his papers quickly and explain the reason for his visit. The guard raised an eyebrow. Not many foreigners made it all the way here. Eventually, the man in silver armor scoffed and gave him his papers back. Good luck with that, he laughed. His papers shoved back into his hands, he nodded and made his way inside. He knew he had come with no easy request, but it was of the utmost importance that he succeeded. The future of his kingdom depended on the outcome of this audience with the empress. Following the long line of people walking in, he was a bit lost inside those high walls and long corridors. He had to ask the imperial servants for directions twice. Thankfully, he had studied enough to know the servants in this place traditionally wore green clothing. Although the empress had abolished the centuries-old imperial decree behind a lot of the rules on the different castes' clothing, the imperial servants most likely wore green out of tradition. Some wore little accessories or pieces of clothing of different colors, but green was still prominent. The man internally congratulated himself for having chosen a simple blue attire. This was the color of scholars, officials, and educated people in general. Everyone showed him respect despite his poor appearance. The journey there had taken a toll on the old man. He had lived over half a century and seen many things, but this may have been the journey of his life. He had always dreamt of coming to this amazing country. Where he came from, many saw the Dragon Empire as a ruthless land with barbarians preying on the weak and monstrous man-killing beasts were allowed to roam free. No foreigner had been let in for a long time. The only ones who could walk into these lands were people of tribes or merchants who wouldn't be so foolish to get close to the capital. Things have changed in recent years. The borders weren't as tightly closed as before. A lot of the cities were now thriving, whereas before, it seemed everything was solely happening in the capital. Since the death of the late emperor, his daughter had been making more and more changes every day. Now, the man was trying to brush some sand out of his hair and beard, and wipe the dust off his clothes. Compared to the other people waiting to see the empress, with their perfect attires and gold jewelry, he looked like a beggar. Strangely though, the line was getting shorter, fast. People who walked inside the throne room didn't seem to spend more than a few minutes before leaving. Oddly enough, the people who came back were often in a curious state. He saw people coming out furious, in tears, or with a lot of joy on their faces. Some didn't come out at all. He couldn't come up with any reasons as to why, as the main room seemed totally soundproof. They only heard something when the door would open, either to welcome the next guests or for the imperial servants going in and out. When he was finally the next one in line, the man took a deep breath, mentally preparing himself. He couldn't be more prepared, but he was still very unsure about all this. His only piece of luggage was his bag, in which he was preciously carrying a little chest he had been protecting with his life throughout this journey. When the doors opened, the man stepped inside, as nervous as an old man like him could be. An imperial servant came to greet him. "Please follow me, and do not speak a word until the empress has authorized you to. You shall not look at their highnesses until they speak to you, either. No weapons are allowed inside the throne room, and you shall be killed immediately if you've brought any without informing us." The man nodded, but he couldn't remember having been searched, which had surprised him. The Imperial Guard had mentioned weapons were forbidden inside the Imperial Palace, but that was it. The security seemed a little lax, in his opinion. He could have gotten this far with a sword and no one would have stopped him. Still, that wasn't something he'd do. His query was way too important to be put at risk like that. He walked slowly, hoping not to make any mistakes that would offend the Empress. He kept his eyes on the impressive, white marble floor, but he could still tell how spectacular this hall was. Each sound resonated throughout, and there had to be large windows for it to be so sunny and warm too. He could almost smell the sunshine coming from left, right, and above. There was a light scent of incense being burned and fruits. The one thing that struck him, though, was the continual strange noises. He had already heard some of them before, while he was waiting outside, but now, the man was getting more curious about those unusual sounds. It was loud, like drums, something resonating inside a huge cave. It was terrifying. He didn't dare look up, but the man could tell he was walking right toward whatever was making that scary noise. He was preceded and guided by an imperial servant, but even without them, he could have easily followed the simple, straight path that took him right to the throne. More precisely, he was asked to stand a few steps away from the first step of a flight of stairs that most likely led to the rumored Golden Throne. Empress, this man claims to have come from the faraway Eastern Kingdom to request an audience with you. He heard a chuckle. The Eastern Kingdom, said a feminine, imperious voice. Does that mean those brats next door are finally done fighting? The man nodded, but was he allowed to answer? He heard that arrogant chuckle again. Interesting. You learn something new every day. How long has it been already? The new king rose to power 5 years ago, Empress, answered a male voice. So it took him 5 years to get them all to sit down and stop shouting? HMPF, the kid didn't waste his time. I don't really care for their stupid republic, though. They were all pretending to be so smart and thought of us as barbarians. I guess a bit of fresh blood will do them some good, some that boy didn't spill. The man took a deep breath. Did he have to endure the Empress insulting his king? Nothing in her words was wrong, though. The former Eastern Republic had endured a cruel defeat against the Dragon Empire 20 years ago. What was more aggravating was that the Republic had started the war. Some of their leaders had been convinced by the Empire's second prince, a cunning man with large ambitions, to agree to this nonsense attack. He had only failed to mention that the third prince, the one known as the war god, would stand in their army's way so fast. In the end, the Eastern Army had been sent home, its pride wrecked to pieces, and a lot to deal with in the aftermath. Those who had agreed to this attack had to come up with some explanations. Those conflicts added to their people's anger after so much death, poverty, and famine, which threw the Eastern Republic into a long civil war. After several attempts at reconstructing themselves, the rise of a new king was the hope he was willing to do anything to protect. Fine. Let's hear it then. What does the brat have to say? The man took a deep breath. Now was finally the time. He had to be very careful with his words. Our king reigns alone and his queen's seat is still empty, Your Highness. Now, I have come forth with the hope to find a suitable partner for him. What was that? said the empress. They want to establish a good relationship with our empire through a wedding, Your Highness, said the male voice. Why do we need that? Asked the empress with a chuckle. For good relations with our neighbors, Your Highness. The empress stayed silent for a couple of seconds. He could hear her fingertips tapping on her golden throne. It was hard to keep his eyes on the floor when he was dying to look up. He finally heard her sigh. What do we need that for, again? The man was speechless. Was the empress playing dumb on purpose? Was she mocking them? He heard the chuckles of two other women, but the man that was speaking like an advisor, or a close counselor, let out a long sigh. Now that their situation is stable, we should look to establish good relationships with our only neighboring nation, Empress. Good relationships with our neighbor means cheaper prices on the imported and exported products, Your Highness. Cheaper prices means less taxes, and the less we tax our people, the happier they get. The Empress brutally slammed her hand, making them all jump. Oh, so this is why, she said with a chuckle. Less yapping from them. All right, let's do it then. You can raise your head. I feel like I'm going to watch your neck break if you keep standing like that. The man finally lifted his head with relief, his neck indeed a bit stiff. He had gotten authorization to look at the Empress, but he certainly wasn't prepared for what he was about to see. The golden throne was higher than he had imagined, and much, much more impressive. That mountain of gold destabilized and blinded him for a second, until he realized it was moving. The throne itself was a very large seat, so large that almost two people could have sat there. It was stuffed with purple cushions as if to fill all that space. However, behind the large throne was this mountain of golden scales. The man swallowed his saliva, realizing this was the source of those terrifying sounds from earlier. It was one of them. One of their dragons. Of course, he had heard about the Dragon Empire's actual dragons. Those magnificent, mythical creatures were no myth in this empire. The dragons were the mark of nobility, and also why no mere mortal had ever been able to take an emperor's seat. Their people only acknowledge the dragon masters, and dragon masters were only born into the imperial family. There was no real explanation as to why they had been blessed with such incredible companions. One possibility was that it was in their blood, and until recently, only the male heirs of the emperor were blessed with a dragon alter ego, a companion for life. They were no mere pets, though. He had heard terrible stories of manslaughter caused by one of those ferocious beasts on a whim, and now, as he witnessed the size of this thing, he sure believed them. He didn't stare at the dragon for long, though. Inside the golden throne sat another one of the most terrifying creatures of this empire, the Empress herself. She was a tall woman, with dark skin and the black hair and eyes typical of their people. The only thing that made it known that she was the Empress was the impressive amount of gold in her hair, clothes, and jewelry. Her dress was purple, but since it was sleeveless and the skirt was slit to let her legs through, it looked like she was wearing more gold than fabric. There was even gold embroidered into her dress. Still, her attire was strangely simple for an empress of the wealthiest nation known on this continent. If it wasn't for her sitting on the throne, he might have wondered which one out of her or the other woman dressed in purple was the empress. There were actually two other women present, instead of one. They were both seated on the stairs below the throne, just a few steps away from him. The first one was obviously a close relative of the empress. She was beautiful, with her very long, black hair in hundreds of braids falling over her shoulders, and just like the empress, she wore purple with some gold jewelry. The other woman was probably a simple imperial servant, although she was allowed to sit there for some reason. She was merely embroidering some purple piece of clothing, and she didn't have the looks of someone who was even from that place. Her white skin shocked him for a second. Never had he seen someone with such light skin, like some white jade. She was looking at her work, so he couldn't tell, but from her chestnut hair and pink lips, she was definitely a foreigner. Trying not to stare too long at either of the women, he looked up at the empress again. Next to her was an elderly man in blue clothing. He glared when their eyes met, so the poor Eastern man had to look elsewhere again. Did the king specify which princess he was hoping to marry? The servant woman suddenly asked. No, your highnesses. So cunning, hissed the empress. That brat sends only a servant, after all this time, and now he asks for one of my nieces to be sent to him? Isn't he quite? The man next to the empress rolled his eyes at her language. I have some gifts for the Dragon Empire and the princess, quickly said the man. They are not much, but I hope this will be taken as a token of stop talking and open that chest, ordered the empress. The man nodded and quickly opened his chest. The truth was, he was very aware of how little this treasure was. Any of the empress bracelets she was wearing were probably a lot more valuable. He was completely at his wits' end, though. If the empress laughed and sent him back, he had no idea what he'd do. To his surprise, the white-skinned woman put her embroidery aside and stood up, coming to take the chest. Had the empress given an order he had missed? He didn't say a thing, though, as she took it. She looked through it and, to his surprise, there was a slight smile on her lips. There are some books in here, she said, taking the only 2 little books included. Yes, Your Highness. Those are very ancient books of our nation. She smiled and turned to the empress. She hadn't touched anything else in the chest. What do you say? She simply asked. The man was shocked. She was allowed to address the empress so casually? However, the empress shrugged. It's your daughters this is about. You take responsibility for it. Her daughters. The man suddenly understood. He had been completely tricked by her outfit. This woman was no servant and no foreigner. She was the one and only war god's wife, the empress sister-in-law, the mother of the crown prince. The most adored woman in this empire. Imperial Princess Cassandra, the water goddess. Do you like tea? She asked softly. Ah. Yes, please. The man was still stunned. The woman before him was a legend in this empire. She was adored like a living deity, perhaps more venerated than the empress herself. Yet, from where he stood, just a couple of steps away from her in this tiny kitchen, she seemed like any ordinary woman, simply pouring tea with a soft, serene smile on her lips. She wasn't even especially beautiful. Her chestnut hair was held in a high and large ponytail, but still so long it fell down to her lower back. She wore no makeup, except perhaps some for her rose-tinted lips, and was actually a bit skinny. Her green dress wasn't any better than those of the servants here, and she only wore a couple of gold jewelry items too. Moreover, he just couldn't get used to how pale her skin was. He'd heard of tribes, in the south, with white-colored skin, but he had never witnessed it himself. "You look tired," she said, presenting him with a cup. "It must have been a long journey." "It was, Your Highness," said the old man, taking it. "It took me over a month to come here, Your Highness." "You may call me Cassandra," she chuckled. "Your Highness is a bit too ceremonial for me. What should I call you?" He stood a bit more upright, trying to forget how dirty he ought to look right now. He had no money to buy clean clothes and wore the same thing for days. Most people would have treated the old man like any beggar, with his messy beard and tired eyes. Yet, this woman didn't even show any sign of discomfort. "This old man's name is Yasum, my lady." "Yasum Himlion the Wise." "Well then, Yasum the Wise," she repeated with a gentle smile, "please tell me about the Eastern Kingdom." The man's hands froze on the cup. He had followed Lady Cassandra, the water goddess, outside the throne room, a bit relieved to escape the arrogant empress gaze, but he had no idea of their real destination or why she was even listening to his demands. She had first stopped by this small kitchen to make the tea. Seeing this living deity pouring tea in a kitchen didn't seem to surprise anyone, as all the servants coming in and out acted as if this was a regular thing that happened, quickly bowing before moving on with their tasks. Now, his cup still in his hands, he kept following her a bit helplessly as Cassandra walked out, back to one of the large corridors of the palace. She was walking slowly, and clearly waiting to hear his answer. The man took a deep breath. "Our king is still young, Lady Cassandra. He is a brave, young man, but he didn't become our king easily. After so many wars and battles, our people were famished, angry, and lost. It must have been hard." "Yes, my lady," sighed the old man. "Very much so. The civil war left many cities in ruins and our roads stained with blood. We are struggling to bring all our systems back to a functioning, let alone flourishing, state. Commerce, finance, education, everything has been shattered, and we hope to build something better out of what was previously destroyed. But it is hard. Even 5 years after our young king rose to power, bandits are still roaming free, terrorizing our already traumatized citizens. Isn't it a bit strange that a king would look for a queen in a situation like this?" Despite Cassandra's gentle voice, the old man frowned. He knew this woman was probably too smart not to have understood already. "We are hoping to confirm our young king's power with a strong lady by his side, Your Highness." "A strong lady from the Dragon Empire." "A lady with a dragon," she whispered. The old man kept his head low. Of course, any sovereign would have been delighted to have the power of a legendary beast to assert their authority. The young king of the Eastern Kingdom, among all, was in dire need of such power. He was a bit more nervous now that the lady clearly knew some of the intentions behind his arrival here. He hadn't intended to hide it, but he did hope this wouldn't come to light so soon. Now he was probably looking like a desperate and shabby old man with big demands. He stopped, his hands tight on the little cup. "Forgive me, Your Highness. You must think I'm a shameless man to have come here without even a decent present for your daughter and make such a demand." Honestly speaking, everything he had heard previously about the Dragon Empire had made him think he was lucky to have kept his head on his shoulders this long. Yet, to his surprise, Lady Cassandra chuckled, and he dared to look up. She was looking at him with that gentle gaze of hers. There was something invisible yet incredible about that woman. How young was she? Perhaps 15 or 20 years younger, at least. Yet, she was looking at him as if she had seen the whole world with those emerald eyes. Yesem had always considered himself a scholar and well-educated man, but he felt like a child in front of this young woman. She gently put her hand on his dirty shoulder. "I think you're a very brave man," she said, "and someone who deeply loves his country." Those few words hit Yesem hard. For a second, the man felt his throat tighten a bit, as if he was about to cry. In a few words, she had said everything that made his trip worthwhile. Even more than that, he felt like he was somewhat acknowledged. All the hardships he had endured to come here felt like a painful but distant memory. He was an old man who had thought this trip might be his last, and now that he was at his destination, he could find a bit of relief in the words of a stranger. "Thank you, my lady." Cassandra smiled and turned around, resuming their walk. Wasn't she going to tell him they would refuse and send him home? Where were they going now? Yesem had the faint thought she might have simply indulged this exhausted visitor, but now, he was reminiscing about her discussion with the empress. Would the water goddess really be willing to give away one of her daughters? Yesem knew she had many children, but all those he had interrogated also said the imperial family was closer than ever in this generation. "Did he mention which one?" she asked softly. "Which one? Which one of my daughters your king wanted to marry?" Once again, he lost his confidence. What should he say? Should he lie, and try asking for any? Or should he simply pretend it was up for them to decide? If the water goddess knew the truth, she would probably not agree to this. Still, seeing how he was taking his time to answer, Cassandra let out a little sigh. "I see." What did she see? Yesem was worried. Had he been exposed already? She was definitely a smart woman. How dare he lie to a living deity? Who was he to come all the way here and ask for a princess to go back with him? Cassandra didn't add anything, but she kept walking in the same direction. She didn't even look offended in any way, but as calm as she was before she had asked the question. Yesem kept following her, still stunned a bit more each second by this woman. All the servants were politely bowing and greeting her, and she'd reply with a smile or a polite answer, very differently from the arrogance he had been prepared for from the Dragon Empire's people. They finally arrived in what seemed like a large garden, a very, very large garden within the palace's walls. This empire's palace seemed as large as a small city from the outside, but Yesem had never imagined it would be so vast it could actually have such a grand garden. It even had a lake. The place was lovely, though, and the grass was very green despite the sun and heat. There were a few trees here and there, and under one of them, nearest to the lake, a group of young people were seated. Cassandra was walking toward the group, and Yesem immediately noticed the striking resemblance between her and some of those children. There were only 2 young women, circled by several younger children on the grass. From what Yesem could see, only one of the 2 young women had the same green eyes as the water goddess. She was young, but already a true beauty, captivating the young ones as she read them a book. She had long hair, just a shade darker than her mother's, and darker, tanned skin, so pretty, a bronze color, almost golden under the sunlight. The contrast with her green eyes was absolutely striking and beautiful. Her back against the tree, she was reading the book she had in her hands to the rest of the group. She had a very pleasant voice, almost as if she was singing, and all of the other children were visibly deeply involved in her reading, sitting with their bodies leaning toward her, or on their stomachs. And the young man ventured for days alone in that desert. He was thirsty, and the scorching heat was terrible to bear, burning his skin. Yet, he kept putting one foot in front of the other, bravely. He knew he had to go through this trial if he hoped to save his family. He spent many days in the desert, and could only rest a few hours, once the sun set and the gentle moon rose. Each night, the beautiful moon reminded him of his lover's beautiful white hair, and gave him courage again for the next day. So, each morning at sunrise, he rose like the sun, and resumed his long journey through the desert. And on the 15th day, said Cassandra, he found an oasis. All the children looked back, only noticing them now. "Mommy!" shouted two of the boys in the group. They suddenly stood up and ran to their mother. Neither of them looked older than 10 years old. The older one of the two arrived first, hugging his mom's legs, while the younger one grabbed her hand. "Mommy, Ceci was reading us a great story." "I know, I love that story." Yesem was baffled. There were a dozen children there, and from what he could see, half of them had light-colored skin. Not as white as the water goddess, but definitely lighter than any other person's skin in the Dragon Empire. He was dying to ask if all 6 were her children, including the 2 young women. Aside from the older boy who had run to his mother, only one of the boys and one of the girls on the grass also had green eyes, all the other children's eyes were dark. But the fact that the one holding her hand had black eyes meant not all her children had inherited that feature. "Children, this is Yesem the Wise. He came from the Eastern Kingdom." All the children suddenly turned their eyes to him, and for a second, the old man felt a bit panicked. However, things didn't turn out at all like he had expected. Actually, the children with darker skin stood up and bowed politely before leaving the grounds. Were those children of servants? The ones with lighter skin that remained were obviously related to the imperial family, and they all wore purple or green clothing. "From the Eastern Kingdom," said the other young woman, sitting next to the one who was reading. "Really?" She bore a close resemblance to the girl next to her, but she had dark eyes, freckles on her nose, and her hair was cut at an unusual shoulder length. She exchanged a look with the young woman next to her. "Yes, my lady," replied Yesem, bowing. "This young woman is Tessa, my niece," said Cassandra. "Next to her is my oldest daughter, Cecilia. Then, there's my third-born daughter, Cassandra." Cassandra waved shyly at him, her big green eyes sparkling with interest. Next to her was a boy about the same age as her and, unlike his younger brothers, he hadn't moved and was frowning instead. "Mother, what does he want?" "This impolite child is my third son, Shannon. And those 2 are his little brothers, Cassandra and Cepheus." Yesem kept nodding, wondering if it was important he remembered all those names. He was trying to do the math in his head to understand how many children the water goddess had. With 5 boys and 3 girls, it meant, at least 8 children. "Where are Kira and Raisa?" she asked the 2 young women. "Raisa is with Mom," answered Tessa. "Kira was with us until an hour ago, I think." Cassandra sighed. "She probably ran off somewhere again. Did she leave Kiki here?" The 2 girls exchanged a look. "I'm not sure," finally muttered Tessa. The princess mother didn't look too happy with that answer. To Yasim's surprise, she turned her eyes toward the sky and the walls of the garden, as if she was looking around for something. "Cray!" she suddenly called loudly. Yasim froze, hearing a sudden, loud noise 1 second later like an earthquake, as well as a gust of wind. He could tell something big was moving on the other side of that wall, something very, very big. A fright chilled the old man's body, as a shadow suddenly grew in front of them. Something dark and incredibly huge. "There you are," sighed Cassandra. The gigantic black dragon stood with all its might, grabbing the top of that wall with its claws as if to support its humongous weight with it. Yasim was struck both by the magnificence and scary size of that creature. Its scales were shining like onyx under the sunlight, and its big, red eyes were like ruby jewels, both gleaming and frightening. It moved its body with surprising grace considering its size, and its movements were akin to a snake or a feline. Its front paws landed one after the other in the grass, and Yasim couldn't help but take a step back as this creature was now in the garden, headed in their direction. "Cray!" exclaimed the 2 younger boys, running toward the beast. It was terrifying to see such young children run fearlessly toward the black dragon, but no one else seemed shocked. Instead, Cassandra crossed her arms and the black dragon kept coming forward, its gigantic tail whipping the air around. Cray growled softly, a growl that echoed throughout the area and left Yasim wondering how big that mouth was, and those fangs. You let Kira leave again, didn't you?" Cassandra scolded the dragon. "Did she feed you meat, Cray? You can't let the children trick you with treats each time." The black dragon laid down in front of the human woman, its head between its paws, and growled again, a short one this time. The 2 boys immediately began climbing to play on its back. Yasim was astonished. A huge creature like that, with such sharp claws, was lying like a house dog in front of the princess? No wonder that woman was considered a living deity. "You're supposed to watch all the children, you know," Cassandra added. "Were you napping?" Cray turned its head to the side, visibly ignoring her scolding. Yasim was truly unable to believe his eyes. Was it only an impression, or had the dragon purposely turned away to pout? Cassandra sighed, putting a hand on her hip. "Fine, I guess I can use the good old method then. Call the little ones, Cray, please." The dragon rose its head, this time glancing toward the lake, and let out a long, more high-pitched growl. Yasim had a hard time keeping his eyes off the majestic yet terrifying creature, but a myriad of little sounds coming from the lake convinced him to glance in that direction next. The water was moving, making small swirls at the surface. Fish? The waves seemed too large to be the work of mere fish. "You should step away from my aunt, old man," said Tessa. Realizing she was talking to him, Yasum carefully distanced himself from the water goddess, who was walking toward the lake. All of a sudden, something jumped out of the water at full speed, splattering the grass around, and began running in the water goddess direction. For a second, Yasum mistook it for a gigantic snake, but it was way too fast. This thing obviously had limbs, 4 of them, and a pair of wings. Another suddenly jumped out of the water, of a different color, and another one after that. In a few seconds' time, no less than 4 little creatures with scales of various shiny colors were running on the grass at a scary speed to get to the princess. Yasum couldn't believe his own eyes. Those little ones were all tiny dragons. Baby dragons. The man was completely baffled. He knew the Dragon Empire had dragons, but he didn't think he'd see so many of them at once, from so close too. Just a few seconds later, the princess was surrounded by those small creatures, all trying to climb over her or making high-pitched sounds at her feet. They were moving around a lot, but thanks to their very different colors, Yasum counted 4 of them. The biggest was a black one, about as big as a large dog or a snow leopard, but including the tail, it was the length of 2 of those. It was rubbing its body like a cat against the princess' leg, and this dragon was a lot like the large one she had called Cray, but with a smaller tail and wings, and a longer body. It was arching itself in Yasum's direction, with glowing sapphire eyes and some faint growling. Another one was next to it, also moving around the princess, visibly trying to approach her without climbing over a light green dragon, which was just a bit smaller. The 2 smallest were the ones climbing all over the princess, trying to get around her shoulders or in her arms. They were both still a bit too big to be there, and were flapping their wings and kept bickering to get more space, even growling at each other in annoyance. One was a bright orange-red color, while the other was dark blue, and it was only thanks to the difference in color that Yasum could follow their bodies, flying around and bickering, until Cassandra clicked her tongue. "Enough, you two." As soon as she did that, both of the small ones jumped down on the grass, a bit quieter, but still rushed beneath their older peers to rub themselves against her ankles too, like angsty kittens. Then, a 5th dragon came out of the water, more shyly than the others. This one was grey, and even bigger than the black and blue-eyed one. Yet, it looked like it was almost afraid of the princess, and tried to slither away. "Kiki!" The dragon froze, and Cray suddenly growled at this little one too. As soon as the big black dragon had growled, all 4 of the little dragons quickly scattered. The 2 small ones ran to the little boys, hiding behind them, while the other 2 went to the elder sister, Cecilia, curling up next to the folds of her purple dress, one on each side, and put their heads on her lap. She chuckled and petted them, but they all had eyes on poor Kiki. Cassandra sighed and walked up to the grey dragon. "Kiki, go find your owner. And you'd better stay with her this time," she said. As soon as she was done talking, the grey dragon flapped its tiny wings, and although it looked like they wouldn't be strong enough to carry its weight, the little one managed to get itself above the wall. Even after Kiki was gone, Yasum was still unable to process what had just happened, what he was seeing. Dragons! Baby dragons everywhere! "Children, go see your Aunt Femera for a little while," Cassandra suddenly said. "I need to talk with your older sister." They all obeyed immediately without a complaint, apparently happy to go see Auntie Mara, their little dragons following after them. Once those four and their dragons were gone, only the two older girls and the huge black dragon were left in the garden. Calm befell the garden and Cassandra smiled at her daughter. "Cecilia, this man has something to ask you." Cecilia exchanged a look with her cousin. "Is it all right if I stay, Auntie?" asked Tessa. Cassandra nodded gently, and the two young women stood up, Cecilia keeping her book tight against her chest. Once she was standing, Yasum noticed that the young lady was obviously tall for her age, perhaps another family trait, from her father's side this time. He had heard rumors about the war god being as tall as a giant. Although he had expected the rumor to be a bit of an exaggeration, Cecilia was definitely not a petite woman. She had her mother's slender figure, though, but more defined muscles, which he could see from her exposed arms. Perhaps because she was a young woman, she wore a bit more jewelry, bracelets, earrings, and also a wide-band golden choker around her neck, covering most of it. Tessa briefly glanced toward her aunt before her dark eyes went to Yasum. Now that he was seeing her from a bit closer, her cousin also had a hint of green in her eyes, although it was very faint. "Cecilia is my eldest daughter, she's 18 years old," said Cassandra. "She and Tessa were born in the same year, which is why they are so close." "Auntie, what is this about?" asked Tessa, frowning. Yasum could see the defiance in her cousin's dark eyes. She was probably well aware of their nation's history together. She didn't bother to hide her frown and acted somewhat cautious, with a hand on her hip. Unlike most women he had seen in the Dragon Empire, Tessa was wearing pants and a cropped top that flattered her flat stomach and curvy figure better than a dress would have, and she wore only green too. Although, she was also wearing several items of gold jewelry, even in her long braids. Yasum also noted how she stood slightly off-profile, as if she was ready to step in between him and Cecilia at any moment. Unlike her, though, Cecilia looked much more relaxed, just a bit curious and surprised. Cassandra glanced his way, so Yasum understood she was expecting him to explain himself alone. He nodded and bowed once more to the two young ladies. "Good morning, my ladies. I am Yasum the Wise, a close advisor to His Highness, King Ashen the White." "King Ashen," repeated Cecilia. Yasum was a bit taken aback by the princess's visible surprise, but he nodded, thinking she ought to be shocked by the reason for his visit after all. "Yes, my lady. I have come to the Dragon Empire to extend my king's request that they provide him with a possible future queen for the Eastern Kingdom." "You want to send Cecilia as a prospective wife, Auntie?" asked Tessa, clearly shocked too. "Only if she wants to go," said Cassandra, very calm, her green eyes on her daughter. For a few seconds, mother and daughter exchanged a long look in silence. Some silent discussion seemed to be happening between them, between Lady Cassandra's calm and gentle expression and that little spark in her daughter's eyes. Then, Cecilia turned to Yasum. "Did the king really ask for me as his wife, Sir Yasum?" Yasum was too shocked to answer her right away. This time, it couldn't be a surprise. Her way of speech. The princess had read that book perfectly fine before, but just now. She was a stutterer. As a man called wise, Yasum quickly hid his surprise and nodded politely. My lord still has no queen by his side, princess, and he is actively looking for one befitting the position. He sent me away to find for him a princess of the Dragon Empire. Yesem knew he was in a dangerous position if he lied to the princess or the imperial family, but the man was at his wit's end and was now betting everything on this moment. He already considered himself quite lucky he had made it this far and that the princess looked interested in his query. "I see," muttered Cecilia, looking down. "You're the only one of age, Cecilia," her mother gently said, "but this is your decision. We don't have any obligation to comply with the king's demand, right, Auntie?" asked Tessa, still frowning. "Of course not." Yesem kept his head down. "No, they didn't have any." He was an old man and had come alone, to almost beg them to agree to send one of their precious daughters to a kingdom they had been at war with for longer than they had been at peace. Moreover, there was no discussion to even be held in terms of difference in power. The Dragon Empire was extremely rich, prosperous, and had dragons to defend it. Whereas their kingdom was barely recovering from the wounds of the past civil wars, a broken system, and the loss of many of their own people. Even if they sent him back in little chunks with an insult tattooed on his forehead, there would be nothing that could be done in retaliation, nothing. Hence, Yesem the Wise was presently very happy to see that Princess Cecilia was actually contemplating his request. He had come with nothing else to give other than a little chest full of cheap treasures and his good word. "Did you ask Aunt Sherian?" asked Cecilia, turning to her mother again. "It's your decision, Ceci. Your decision alone. Your aunt allowed this man to meet you, didn't she?" Cecilia's eyes went back to Yesem, and she gave him a faint smile. The old man was grateful but still surprised. Was the princess seriously considering this? Going to a kingdom she knew nothing of to meet a complete stranger? As she remained silent a bit longer, he decided to take a little step forward, bowing again, and push his luck. "Our king is young, my lady, but a very handsome and smart man. He is named Ashen the White King, and just 3 years older than you." "Ashen?" "Yes, my lady," said the man, bowing deeper. A silence followed, and Yesem wondered if he wasn't overstepping. Yet, none of the women said anything, until he raised his head and saw the princess' conflicted green eyes. "Why is that his name?" "The White King?" asked Cecilia. "That is because our king's hair is white, my lady, like the great god in our lore." "White," she repeated, visibly surprised. "Yes." Cecilia sighed faintly. Her fingers were fidgeting against her book, and her eyes were looking vacantly at the grass. "Ceci," called out her cousin, seemingly worried. "You want to go, don't you?" Cassandra's words surprised Yesem, but Cecilia's expression when she turned her green eyes back to her mother surprised him even more so. There was a strange glimmer of excitement in her eyes. She bit her lower lip slightly. "Yes, but... Father! Are you scared of your father's reaction?" "I'm not scared of father, but... if he says no..." Cassandra let out a long sigh and stepped forward, suddenly hugging her daughter gently. Cecilia's eyes opened a bit wider in surprise, but she hugged her mother back with one arm. When she finally stepped back, Cassandra smiled gently at her and caressed her long curls. "Cecilia, do you remember what I told Kiera last week?" That we all have an adventure to live, but Kiera was too impatient for hers. That's right. I believe this is your adventure, Ceci. The one you have been waiting for, patiently. Unlike your sister. Both women chuckled. Then, Cassandra tenderly grasped her daughter's chin with her hand. You're too cautious, as always, and too scared. Don't be. You're much stronger than you think, Ceci. You're an amazing young woman and very smart too. I think it's time you learn to bloom on your own, my love, away from the nest. When she let go, her daughter was blushing, but smiling, looking a bit happier. Next to her, her cousin chuckled, crossing her arms. Don't worry, she said. I'm not letting you go anywhere without me, and I'm actually curious about that neighbor of ours. Are you going to, Tessa? Asked Cassandra, raising an eyebrow. Of course. I'm not letting Ceci go there on her own. I don't mind, but what will your mother say? Tessa suddenly grimaced. Can't you come up with an X? I am not lying to my own sister for your sake, Tessa, interrupted Cassandra. But Mom will never let me, protested the young woman. She's worse than a harpy and she will complain about me not helping at the shop. She doesn't care about me wandering around, but if she hears I'm going to the other side of the frontier, she will drag me back and lock me up. You know she's able to. You forget about your dad, chuckled Cassandra. What about him? Anur will be worried sick if you disappear out of the blue. Tessa stayed silent for a second, then her eyes lit up. All right, I'll send word to Dad then. He'll be so much more terrified to tell Mom the truth. It will give me at least a week before she picks up on something. You're going to be in trouble. Don't worry, Ceci, my dad will probably take half of my mom's wrath first. Poor Anur, sighed Cassandra. All right then, I will talk to your mother later, but you girls should go to the Onyx castle first. What about my brothers? Asked Cecilia, looking a bit worried. If they know. Your father sent them both to train in the mountains, they aren't there at the moment. That's why you should go see him now before they come back. Cassandra stepped forward to hug her daughter, and then her niece, and Yasim suddenly realized they were already saying goodbye. My ladies, I know it is a long journey to the Eastern Kingdom, he said, but there really isn't such a hurry. Oh, we'd better get out of here before my mom finds out, retorted Tessa. It's all right, chuckled Cassandra. If you fly there, it will only take a few hours. Cecilia can come back any time she wants, even tonight, if she doesn't like it. Moreover, she should leave before her younger siblings take notice too, otherwise, you will have 4 more dragons following you. I think even for His Majesty, that would be a bit too many guests at once. Yasim was astonished. The Dragon Empire's people really thought differently. Not only was the water goddess fine with sending her daughter away, but she was sending her, right away? He glanced toward the majestic black dragon next to them. From what he had seen, all the children had their own dragons, so it made sense that Princess Cecilia could indeed fly wherever she wanted, anytime she wanted. Still, Yasim was a bit worried. What if, once the princess knew the truth, she prematurely decided to leave? He'd be losing his old head this time. There. To Yasam's surprise, without him noticing, some servants had arrived, one holding the little chest he had brought with him. The others were bringing 2 satchels for the young women. Cassandra took the little chest and handed it to her daughter with a faint smile, glancing toward Yasam. Sir, Yasam came with these, as an offering for you. Really? Asked Cecilia. Ah, yes, Princess, said the man, bowing. All those are for you. The princess opened the chest, visibly a bit excited. Yasam's heart was beating fast. They were very small and humble treasures, but he had hoped the daughter would find something of worth in there like her mother had. Next to her, Tessa was grimacing while staring at the contents of the little chest, but she didn't say anything, even when Cecilia handed the chest to her as she took the books out. I had been looking for these books, she exclaimed, staring at the old books in awe. Those are rare editions, my lady, said Yasam, a bit flattered. I know. They were mentioned once in another one I had been reading, and I was dying to find them. Even my brother tried to find them for me but couldn't. Thank you, Sir Yasam. I'm glad they make you happy, my lady. Yasam noticed how she stuttered a bit less when she was happy. The Princess' emerald eyes were sparkling with happiness as she held the volumes and kept caressing their covers with her fingers, obviously thrilled. He smiled too, unable to hold it back as her smile was so beautiful. Princess Cecilia seemed like a beautiful and intelligent young woman indeed. Yasam bowed again, praying loudly in his heart that the princess and her dazzling green eyes could warm the White King's ice-cold heart. Chapter 2 Ask Nebera if you need anything else, said Cassandra as Tessa took the bags from the servant's hands. I will. Are you sure this is fine, Mom? Muttered Cecilia. Her mother smiled gently and caressed her hair a bit more. I have a good feeling. Plus, you're going with Tessa. What should I be worried about? Behind Cecilia, Tessa gave her aunt a confident nod and walked up to the black dragon, leaving the poor old Yasam in awe. It couldn't be. Those girls were preparing to ride this beast? With him. Cecilia lovingly hugged her mother, then walked up to Cray, gently patting its snout, while her cousin was already climbing onto the dragon's back. Once on top, the young woman put down the 2 satchels and held out her hand to help Cecilia climb up. Hurry up, old man, she suddenly shouted at Yasam. My ladies, you're not expecting me to mount this deity creature. The deity creature will be 20 times faster than a horse, sighed Tessa, and I promise he won't eat you unless we ask him to. Yasam let his jaw down without thinking and turned to Lady Cassandra. The dragons really eat humans. Don't worry, chuckled the princess. This one's been on a low human diet for a few years now. Yasam needed a few seconds to process those words, wondering if she was simply toying with him. They wouldn't really have let a creature that could eat human beings near the imperial children, right? Seeing the 2 young ladies ready to go and waiting for him, Yasam had no choice but to move, and he did so very, very carefully. The old man took a long detour around the mighty black dragon, even though Cray visibly had no interest in him. Instead, it raised its head high for Cecilia to scratch behind its horns, making high-pitched sounds of satisfaction. Yasam had to gather all the courage he had left in his body to accept Lady Tessa's help and set foot on the onyx scales. The height once on the dragon's back was impressive, but he didn't have time to look down. He was seated right behind Tessa, who quickly explained to him where to hang on. "Cray, let's go," gently said Cecilia, patting its neck. The dragon turned its head to Cassandra, who gave it a gentle pat on the hip before standing back. Yesem was terrified, but he thought he was a blessed mortal to ever be given a chance to climb on a dragon's back and ride it. The large black wings spread far on the sides, showing off the dragon's unexpected width, and Cray flapped them twice before suddenly taking off. The climb was so sudden, it felt like the dragon had jumped up and forgot to fall back down. Yesem gasped loudly and held on, frozen by fear. He was riding a dragon. "Close your mouth, old man," chuckled Tessa. "You won't like it if something flies in." "Sir Yesem," said Cecilia. "We can make stops if you need. Dragon flying can be difficult for elders." "Our grandmother hates flying now," nodded her cousin. "She always says she'd rather walk all the way from the Diamond Palace to the Imperial Palace than mount a dragon again." "I am all right, my ladies," lied Yesem with a grimace. "I am honored to be allowed to fly this wonderful creature. Do you mind if I ask a few questions, though? The old man I am still holds much curiosity for the wonders of the Dragon Empire, and now that I have seen this, I can't help but wonder." "Ask away," nodded Tessa. "Most people in this empire don't get to see the dragons often either, to be honest. Only my little sister goes out with hers." Yesem nodded. He had understood the young lady Kiera was one to run away, but it looked like the younger siblings were usually watched by this adult dragon. "May I ask about this magnificent dragon? I wonder about the size difference with the younger ones from earlier." "Cray is father's dragon," said Cecilia. "The dragons you saw earlier were babies," explained Tessa. "Dragons don't grow like humans, they undergo major growth spurts when their master matures, around teenage years. We don't know much about the reasons behind the size differences from one dragon to another, but the stronger their master, the bigger the dragon. You saw Auntie Sherian's golden dragon earlier, right? That's Glahad, our grandfather's dragon. He's getting smaller with the years because his owner passed. When I was a baby, Glahad was much bigger than Cray. Cray is still growing too." Perhaps from hearing its name, the black dragon let out a long growl, and Cecilia gently patted its neck. Yesem was stunned. So this red-eyed dragon was the war god's dragon itself? Moreover, if the golden dragon from earlier used to be bigger, he couldn't even imagine that mountain of scales moving. It was worth 10 armies. The old man took a few minutes to rethink everything he had ever learned about the Dragon Empire's dragons, but he had just learned more in a few minutes than in years of study. Somewhere in his heart, the old Yesem felt incredibly grateful to have lived to this day. However, he couldn't just be stunned by the moment and forget his mission. As beautiful and impressive as the wonders of the Dragon Empire were, his heart was solidly chained to the Eastern Kingdom's fate. Those dragons were a magnificent gift, but a much more important creature was riding one at the moment. He ought to be sure of who he was tying his fate to, and perhaps his king's too. "Lady Tessa, may I ask how come you're also speaking as one of the former emperor's granddaughters?" "My father was one of his sons and Auntie Sherian's half-brother," Tessa explained, "but like our other uncles and aunties, my dad abandoned his title as an imperial prince after Cecilia took the throne to simplify the succession for Ceci's big brother. I have no title, I'm merely a relative of the imperial family and a merchant's daughter, although Ceci and I are cousins from both our mother's and father's sides." The two girls smiled at each other, looking as close as sisters indeed. Yesem was impressed. All of his teaching about the Dragon Empire had shown centuries of fighting between all the previous emperors, many concubines and children for the succession. For each new ruler, a long trail of blood had to be spilled for him to access the Golden Throne, his hands dirted by many of his siblings' blood. It was no secret that most concubines weren't afraid to kill to protect their progeny if said progeny didn't kill their own siblings themselves once they were old enough. Even Empress Cecialia's generation had been the theater of an impressive war between her father's 6 sons. Yesem thought he had come prepared, knowing that Empress Cecilia had been crowned despite 3 out of her 6 brothers still being alive, but now, it turned out this was all a peaceful agreement between the remaining siblings. His scenario of the war god scaring his 2 younger siblings into obedience was completely wrong. As it turned out, both had willingly forfeited their lineage for their nephew to become the heir apparent. This was truly an amazing empire. Isn't His Highness, your father, retaining any desire to return to the imperial palace? My dad, scoffed Tessa. He's better off away from it. He only goes once in a while to deliver our aunt her favorite alcohol from our family brewery my mother established, and that's it. Yesem was speechless. A former imperial prince was now a family man and an alcohol merchant? How unbelievable! Our turn to ask questions, exclaimed Tessa with a big smile, brushing her flying hair and little braids out of her face. Tell us about your king that wants to marry Ceci. How is he? You said he's young, isn't he? Yesem's expression fell before he could remember to control it, so he bowed as much as he could while riding a flying mount to hide his face. Yes, my lady. King Ashen the White is young, but an admirable, young king. Our kingdom has suffered many difficult years. Your kingdom used to be a republic, didn't it? Scoffed Tessa. We were taught about your civil wars too. You guys fell for one tyrant after another, and you called us asterisk because we are an empire. Tessa, muttered Cecilia, pulling her cousin's sleeve. It's true, my ladies, sighed Yesem. Our system was failing long before we sought war with the Dragon Empire, that is the truth. The gap between our poor citizens and the rich elites brought the goddess of war upon our nation. Our once wise leaders were no better than an assembly of greedy people back then, seeking to put the blame for failure on each other, with only a handful daring to take responsibility and find better solutions. And those who did were quickly blamed for any new failure to bring back the equilibrium and killed as an example until no one dared to speak anymore. Was there no leader to make a decision? Asked Cecilia. There were leaders, my lady, but most were too worried about protecting themselves from our angry people to dare speak up and act. The issue with our former republic was that once a leader stood out, he didn't have enough power to carry his actions efficiently. Thus, all the good men who could have brought change found themselves powerless and were considered failures instead of given the support they needed. But you still managed to decide to go to war with our empire 20 years ago, said Tessa. Yes, my lady. A lot of those leaders were blinded by the promise of treasures and better days. Many of our famished citizens enrolled in that war hoping to get money to send to their families. Yesem sighed, and shook his head. Once we lost the war and the army returned, utterly defeated, anger rose once again, and our republic fell into the hands of the goddess of chaos. Our infuriated citizens attacked the noble houses to steal what they could, good citizens became bandits overnight, and no power was strong enough to stop the chaos. The goddess of chaos kept her power over our lands for 10 years like this, whilst many tried to stop the madness. 10 years, grumbled Tessa. That's right, my lady. For 10 years, our nation slowly fell into chaos. The fights stopped at times, everyone trying to find what they could of a normal life, hoping a new leader would emerge soon to bring back the peace, but, for many, the anger was too strong. The nobles who tried to seize power were overthrown one after the other by citizens who couldn't stand to see their former masters wield the power again. Until, 12 years ago, a man who could finally lead us rose. He declared himself the new king, former General Ashtaran. Ashtaran. General Ashtaran was no noble like the previous men who had tried to conquer our land. He had once been one of the noble's servants and had risen through hard work and devotion to his position. Hence, our citizens liked this man much better than the previous nobles, and when he took power, no one tried to stop him. To stop him, repeated Tessa, frowning. You make it sound like this general wasn't such good news. Yesem shook his head slowly. To this day, this old servant still believes the price for bringing back peace was too costly. The general gathered many of those who had once been his men and created a new army with his own colors. You're saying he stopped the chaos through more violence, then? Yes, my lady. The new king's rule was cruel, ruthless, and terrified our citizens into obedience. However, this new regime worked to stop a lot of the bandits who were constantly harassing the defenseless, so slowly, our people abided by it, fearing our new king as much as those he protected them from. Yesem glanced toward the green-eyed princess. She was obviously listening with a hint of sadness in her eyes, but in silence. Was it because of her speech impairment that this princess was much quieter than her cousin? He could see in her eyes she was very captivated, though, as if she were listening to a fascinating story, breathing a bit more intensely. The old man resumed, his old heart still with the hope that this young woman could one day shift the fate of their kingdom too. The harsh policies of King Ashtaran brought him to more and more extreme ends. The image our new king had was extremely conflicted. Some saw him as a tyrant, others as a hero. Out of fear that civil wars and infighting would destroy our nation from within again, the new king let absolutely no mistake slip through. Some were grateful for how efficient his policies were at cleaning our streets, but others tried to plead that the king was far too merciless. Any crime resulted in a death sentence, even the smallest thefts. As one of his servants myself, I witnessed the long lines of people being given their death sentence, every day. It didn't matter the age, gender, or wealth of the ones who had been accused of being criminals. King Ashtaran's men were judge, jury, and executioner, leaving no time for people to get back on their feet on their own. Many people only had the choice to starve or be killed as a thief. That's depressing, grumbled Tessa. All right, we get the picture, but how did that change from the general to your present king? You said the new one rose to power only 5 years ago. Is he his son or something? We're certainly not going if he's another bloodthirsty tyrant. King Ashen is the general's son indeed, Yasim slowly nodded, but unlike what you think, our king didn't succeed his father. A few years later in the general's reign, more and more people, seeing he couldn't be reasoned with and had no intention to bring back the democracy or republic system, tried to murder him. It was said that one of his sons, Prince Ashen, was one of the victims of those murder attempts. The two young women exchanged a glance. Wait. You're saying your king died? Is this a joke? No, my lady. Rumor has it that Prince Ashen died 7 years ago. After his death, the king got even more ruthless, and with more people protesting against him, new civil wars began, even worse than the first time. Our nation was torn between the security provided by a tyrant leader and our desire for peace and freedom. However, everything stopped 5 years ago upon Prince Ashen's return. He returned? From the dead, said Tessa, raising an eyebrow. Yes, my lady. The prince came back, out of nowhere, after 2 years. He was the general's mistress' son and, if I'm allowed to say such a thing, the only one of the general's sons our people had sympathy for or didn't care about at all. Yet, he returned from the dead, his hair white like the goddess of death, and killed the general, his own father. He did what? Yasim took a deep breath. That is the truth, my lady. After many fights had happened already, at dawn, a white king rose, on the castle's walls, holding the tyrant's head, and threw it to the angry citizens' feet. That white king was the former Prince Ashen, as many recognized him easily. That morning, he spoke loudly and said he had been sent to the gods, but the gods had only taken him to their realm for the sake of the Eastern Kingdom's people. The gods themselves had trained him to become a worthy king for our kingdom. As proof, the gods had sent him back with his hair completely white, a legendary armor made of a dragon's skin, and the strength of a god. The cousins exchanged a glance, both visibly surprised and doubtful. Well, congrats, scoffed Tessa. It sounds like you guys traded a tyrant for a psycho. Despite the young woman's harsh words, Yasim couldn't even answer anything to that. In a way, he knew his home nation had traded the worst possible outcome for another, not much brighter one. Better than anyone else perhaps, he knew how complicated and deep the situation was for the king of the East. The white-haired young man had returned, grown and much more mature than the child everyone had remembered, with a gigantic, dark hole in his heart, and that rage that wouldn't leave his eyes. The truth was, perhaps the new king would end up being worse than his father. In a desperate desire for another leader and a different outcome, perhaps they had sealed their fate. Yet, when Yasim looked ahead at the young green-eyed woman, a light of hope appeared in his old heart. He had come here on a crazy bet, a silly idea. As old as he was, Yasim wasn't scared to die, if not in vain or painfully. However, this old man wouldn't be able to lie peacefully if he couldn't try, one last time, to do something for his country. It was too soon to tell the truth to the princess, and he knew he'd pay the price later. But, if by an incredible chance, his assumption turned out to be right, this old servant would be truly grateful he hadn't made this journey in vain. "What's your relationship to the king?" asked Tessa. "He only sent one man to the Dragon Empire to fetch him a wife," Isn't that too few? Yesem bowed as much as he could, while trying not to fall off. His Highness charged this mission to this servant alone, my lady. While the previous king was still alive, I was tasked with the education of the young prince, and I taught him all I could, to the best of my abilities. I watched over this young man for many years, and I believe I am one of his closest aides. Our king is young, and due to the chaotic past of our nation, he still has many enemies. I am sad to admit, the people our king can truly trust are too few. A real nest of snakes, then. So, he sent you here almost on a secret mission, then. No one else knows I was sent here, admitted Yesem. It was important to him not to lie to their highnesses, at least to avoid it as much as he could. He was already incredibly lucky that the princess had agreed to this insane request, and he was mentally preparing for when the truth would be unveiled at any moment. He only hoped he'd get a chance to offer his apologies. Sounds like a lot of fun, chuckled Tessa, playing around with one of her braids. Oh well, it will be entertaining at least. It was impressive how those young ladies didn't seem to fear anything, not even going to a different land to face a king who had allegedly killed his own father. Yesem felt their countries, despite many similarities, were still two different worlds. He couldn't help but feel saddened as the gigantic black dragon flew effortlessly above the lands and villages, the citizens of the Dragon Empire appearing like tiny dots far below. Those forests were green, their lands full of growing crops, the houses full of happy families living their everyday lives under a stable empire. The Eastern Kingdom knew little about their neighbor because they had too much to figure out on their own. How much would both countries have thrived if there had been any room to learn from the other? As a wise man and scholar, Yesem could only feel disheartened by all that knowledge that wasn't shared, how so much hatred and doubt had been fueled instead of trust. She had no idea yet, but this young princess might be the one to bring an incredible change to both nations' futures. As the girls had mentioned, riding a dragon was bound to bring them to their destination faster than any horse. After a while, the landscapes below and ahead slightly changed, mountains perking up right in front of them. The villages and human habitations were getting rarer as well, and the temperature was getting colder around them. They had been flying for a while, and Yesem was glad he had brought a cape, but he was not ready for the north of the empire. Unlike their kingdom, the Dragon Empire was more lengthy than wide, hence, its northern regions were much colder than the capital, and most of their lands. From afar, he spotted the dark building. It wasn't just a black castle, the fortress was shining incredibly as the sun was setting in the sky. Was it getting late already? Yesem hadn't realized. He had arrived in the capital that morning, waited a long time to see the empress, and now, had spent even longer on a dragon's back. Neither the dragon carrying them nor the young ladies seemed in need of a break. While Cray was only flapping its wings lazily from time to time, the girls ate meat-filled buns from their satchels, giving Yesem one, and enjoyed the ride quietly, obviously used to this. The wind was getting stronger, colder, and louder, hence they couldn't speak much for now. When the black dragon started descending, the old man felt most grateful to finally catch a break. Although the ride was rather stable, it was very uncomfortable to sit on a scaled and not flat seat. What he hadn't expected, though, was the actual size of that castle. He had been impressed by the incredible size of the imperial palace in the capital, but he hadn't expected there would be any other big structures in the empire. Yet, this castle was getting bigger and bigger, and they weren't closed yet. He had been misled by the lack of other buildings or villages around to compare the size, but he really understood how he'd been fooled when he realized that what he had mistaken for a small statue was actually another full-sized dragon. The beast was growling loudly as they approached, and Yasim was impressed by the mighty creature. This one wasn't as big as the war god's dragon, but it was certainly the closest he had seen so far. Unlike the not-so-small ones from earlier, this yellowish-brown one was an adult size, as large and long as 5 horses, and just a bit smaller than Cray. Moreover, it wouldn't stop moving its scaly body around, growling loudly as they landed. "Hi, Dran!" exclaimed Tessa, jumping down as soon as Cray landed. "It's my second brother's dragon," explained Cecilia as she gently helped Yasim come down. "Oh. So this is what Lady Tessa meant about the dragon's size earlier." Yasim was once again genuinely impressed, but also terrified. This dragon was an adult size, and very unruly, growling and pulling on the chain around its neck to try and get closer to the girls. Its claws had ravaged all the soil around it. Yasim was surprised to see one of the dragons chained. So they didn't leave those creatures completely free, after all? Behind them, Cray loudly growled after Dran the yellow dragon, and both began exchanging deafening growls. "Oh, he's probably being punished," grimaced Tessa. "Don't get close to Dran, old man, he's a bit more dangerous, and he's stupid enough that he'd bite you without thinking." Dragon teenagehood. Yasim nodded helplessly, but even without Tessa's warning, he would have never been brave enough to approach the reckless dragon of his own volition. This one was visibly younger than Cray, and much more agitated, growling and showing its fangs, its tail whipping the air and knocking against the wall behind it. If it hadn't been chained, what havoc such a creature could have caused, Yasim didn't even dare imagine. And this was only one of the many dragons they had. Because he had been too captivated by the appearance of another one of those creatures, Yasim almost missed the man coming out of the castle's gates. Not that he could be missed, though, he had never seen such an imposing man. This couldn't be anyone else but the war god himself. He was moving like a deity among mortals, his impressive body exuding an immeasurable strength and aura. His dark eyes were pinning the old man right where he stood, as if they mirrored storm and chaos, ready to unleash hell. The man was wearing a thick, black cape on his shoulders, confounding his long, black hair. He had strong features, a straight jawline, and a presence that imposed respect right away. Not even the most brazen soldier would have dared step out of line. Yet, the young princess smiled and ran fearlessly into this man's arms. "Dad!" The war god opened his arms right before his daughter reached him, and hugged her back, a slight smile appearing on his lips as the girl disappeared in his embrace. "Ceci." One word, but a voice as deep as a volcano. Yasim felt a strange emotion surge in him as he realized that he was given the chance to meet this living legend, and the old man bowed right away, very emotional. After the empress, the war god himself was standing before him. The old man was shaking a bit, but being intimidated was expected. What he had not foreseen, however, was how incredibly gentle and fatherly the war god was toward his daughter. He hugged Cecilia for several seconds and reluctantly stepped away from her to stare at her as if he hadn't seen his daughter in a while. He even caressed her hair and kept a hand on her back. "Hi, uncle," said Tessa, waving at him. "Tessa." He nodded, greeting his niece before looking at his daughter again. "What are you both doing here?" Cecilia briefly glanced back at Yasim, and suddenly, the old man felt the pressure of the war god's stare on him, and bowed again, worried sick. This man obviously loves his daughter. Would he be willing to let her go? "This is Yasim the Wise, father. He came from the Eastern Kingdom." The war god didn't answer to that, adding to Yasim's anxiety. He had come to take this man's daughter to another country. He wouldn't even dare cry if he was about to get his head cut off. "Come inside." While neither of the girls seemed scared at all by the living god, poor Yasim's legs were ready to give in at any minute, and if it wasn't for Dran's sudden growl behind him, perhaps he wouldn't have dared to straighten back up and follow them inside. "Father, why is Dran chained?" asked Ceci, holding her father's arm as they walked inside. "He's being punished. That he destroyed a mountain," suddenly answered a feminine voice from inside. "Auntie Nebi." A beautiful woman appeared, with long, dark hair and pouty lips. She was wearing a floor-length, green dress and a coat, and from the way she carried a pile of clean clothes, she was probably a servant here, but to Yasim's surprise, both girls greeted her like a family member. "What did they do?" laughed Tessa. "They decided it would be fun to play between the mountains, until they broke several rocks and provoked a landslide," sighed the dark-haired woman. "Darson is not to come back until he puts it all back up, and Dran is not allowed to help him." She sent a glare toward the yellow beast, who answered with a growl. Yasim was lost. It couldn't be that the war god had sent his son to put the mountain back with his bare hands only? What kind of young man could do such a thing? It would take months, even if it was possible. Those people had to be living in a different world or holding some secret power he hadn't grasped. "What are you girls doing here?" frowned the servant woman. "Did Kira run away again?" "She's not here." "We know," chuckled Tessa. "She probably ran to grandmother's or somewhere in the capital with her friend." "I need to talk to father," muttered Cecilia. Yasim took note that the young woman did seem nervous, and it reflected in her way of speech. The big, hopeful eyes she had on her father didn't match his kind expression while looking at her, which made the old man more nervous. Princess Cecilia expected her father to be reluctant to do this. Noticing the exchange between those two, and her eyes gliding over the old man, Aunt Nebi frowned, but Tessa walked ahead, grabbing some towels. "Aunt Nebra, should we make some tea first? And I have a few things to ask you to help us with." Taking her cue, Nebra nodded, and the two women quietly left, both sending worried or curious glances toward the strange trio left behind. Poor Yasim was due for another dose of anxiety. He, along with the princess, to explain to her father that he was about to take her to his king, a ruthless, young man who had beheaded his own father and taken over the kingdom by force? Even the bravest man in the empire would have begged the gods for mercy already. However, before the old man could lose the few white hairs he had left, Cecilia and her father walked to a room, a little salon on the side. There was the biggest fireplace he had ever seen, with a large fire easily warming up the whole room, and several huge cushions on a large carpet. There was only one massive wooden seat, but neither Cecilia nor her father sat. The war god removed his cape and threw it on the seat, and added wood to the fire with a dark expression. Cecilia was standing behind him, but after a while, she gently grabbed one of his hands with hers. "Father! I want to go to the east. Eastern Kingdom," she muttered. "Why?" His question had come right away, with something strong in his voice. It didn't sound like anger, just determination. Yesem was surprised he hadn't even been asked anything yet, but for the war god, only his daughter seemed to be here. He turned to her, and it was truly moving to see such an imposing and strong man have such tender gestures toward the young woman. "I really want to go," simply said Cecilia. Although she had a tiny and hesitant voice, her green eyes were full of determination and unafraid to hold her father's dark gaze too. "King Ashen asked to see me," she resumed. I want to go. To see you." This time, the war god's words were directed at Yusum, and so was his terrifying glare. The old man bowed quickly, his throat tight, but he ought to at least say something. "Princess Cecilia is invited by His Majesty, in hopes of standing as his queen." "His queen," repeated the war god. His voice was deep, and his emotions even harder to decipher. Yesem was silently praying to every god and goddess he knew, and hoping he'd be spared to see his plan succeed or fail. If only he could bring Princess Cecilia to His Majesty, then perhaps there was hope. For now, though, the mountain standing before him was no other than the war god and a father who cherished his daughter deeply. Yesem was truly having a hard time understanding what those people were thinking, but he was already shocked that the war god hadn't yet kicked him out or killed him. Instead, his eyes were still on Cecilia, perhaps conflicted. Was his daughter's hopeful gaze making him really consider this insane request? "What did your mother say?" "Mother said I could decide and live my own adventure," quickly answered Cecilia. She agreed. "Dad, please." The war god let out a long sigh, and it felt as if a gush of hot wind was running through the room to echo his frustration. Yesem wasn't cold anymore, he was sweating profusely. However, the war god raised his hand to gently caress his daughter's cheek. Then, his fingers went down to her neck covered by her golden choker, and he frowned even more. "Don't do anything you don't want to," he suddenly said. "I know, Dad. Don't let anyone touch you, insult you, or annoy you. If they do, punish them. Do not be scared, Ceci. Even if you kill him, it's fine. If you want to burn their whole country down, it's fine." Yesem was on the verge of passing out from hearing this, but Cecilia simply chuckled. "I understand. Take Cray with you." "Dad, is it all right? It's your dragon." Her father didn't answer, but a loud growl resonated outside. Yesem couldn't believe what he was hearing. The black dragon was not just going to take them there, it was going to stay with the princess all along? The war god's legendary dragon itself. Yesem suddenly met the war god's eyes, and the dark gaze immediately changed into a life-threatening glare. The old man froze in utter fear instead of bowing again. "If anything happens to Ceci, you're all dead." He had said that with incredible calm, yet his ice-cold voice left no doubt. The Eastern Kingdom's fate now entirely relied on the well-being and future of that one young woman. Yesem bowed and heard himself thank the war god, but in his heart, he knew he had sealed his own country's future. Either his plan succeeded, or they would now be doomed for real. "Are you planning to destroy them already, uncle?" chuckled a feminine voice. Tessa was back, carrying a large tray with tea and dried fruits. She put it down on the table, but her confident attitude suddenly disappeared as she met her uncle's eyes. Yesem was still trying to grasp the dynamics of that family, but it was clear the young woman was also cautious in her uncle's presence. She nodded slightly. "I'm going with Ceci," she said before he asked anything. "I won't let anything happen to her." Cecilia stared at her cousin with a surprised expression, but Tessa was holding her uncle's stare without fail. The cousin's dark eyes were suddenly shining with determination, as if she was making a very serious promise. What was this about? Once again, Yesem felt like there was more meaning to her words than what he could witness. Was this related to the princess' speech impairment? There was definitely something about her, and the way her family members reacted to her, treating her very preciously. The war god didn't answer and, instead, turned back to Cecilia. "Just the two of you," he frowned. "And Cray," smiled his daughter. "It will be fine."